I'm here today really to tell you a little bit more about the business model of, in particular, my company Tipolis, but also I think you could probably think of it as broadly applicable for many of the other peers in the space, so Prosper as well. There might be minor differences, but nonetheless, I think the sort of fundamental business behind it is what we're going to go through today. So just a little bit about Tipolis. We're a Singapore company, really operating all over the world. And then an outline for this talk. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the visible trend that there is towards more zones and more autonomous zones, and then how to capitalize on it, or at least how we think that we can capitalize on it. At the end, I'll show you that there are, in fact, many case studies with which to learn from. It doesn't necessarily mean any one company will succeed in this space necessarily, but just that the space is, in fact, growing, and we think that there is going to be some successful companies coming out of it. So you can see here this trend showing from, I can't even remember what year that is, 1960, something like that, with about, 30 or so special economic zones in 10 plus jurisdictions. And then over on the right here, I think the last year is maybe 2022, and you can see there's close to 6,000 zones in just about every economy across the globe, save for Western Europe, the United States, and just a handful of others. So you can see that these are definitely growing. Now, not all of them are fully utilized, but I think the trend's pretty clear. At the same time, zones are actually becoming more autonomous. We had the original zones that were really export processing, then started to include light manufacturing, tourism then started to flow into it, then financial services. And we believe that the trend actually was starting before COVID, but nonetheless, COVID helped, that actually location is more important now. And so the key is that we need zones that are more autonomous, that are more nimble, and can attract whichever industries that it is that they think is most profitable. So what's the problem? The problem is that standard special economic zones are no longer enough. We actually need to innovate at the institutional level. And the key to innovating at the institutional level is actually that you need the for-profit, profit and loss motivator for a company, and they need to have the autonomy to adjust to what the market conditions are at any one time. In some sense, special economic zones are a free market innovation. In other senses, they're actually central planning. We're saying we want this zone for this specific thing. And the trend is actually to be more agnostic. We don't know what the next thing is. We want to let entrepreneurs in the space of zones actually try to find that. So the solution is what we call international cities. That's what Tipolis is building. Prosper would be a very similar model. So imagine the basic services of a state provided by a company, a for-profit company. You have a contract with that city operator. That outlines your rights, your responsibilities, your duties. It also outlines exactly what you are supposed to pay in terms of fees, as opposed to some sort of tax bill that can be voted on by people outside your control. The host nation that you work under is actually your partner in the project. They are guaranteeing your autonomy for the long term. They are providing some services and guaranteeing your autonomy so that you can operate within the free market within the zone. So the sort of technical aspect to this is that we think of these as special administrative regions. They have the internal autonomy, dispute resolution autonomy. They are under the sovereignty of a host nation. I think Bob mentioned it earlier, and many others have as well. It actually takes an act of sovereignty to create these zones. It's not giving necessarily sovereignty to these zones. The Constitution and largely foreign policy and international affairs are still under the domain of the host nation. Here's the list of the typical sorts of autonomies that we're asking for when we are in discussions with governments. Doesn't necessarily mean that we get all of them. There are a few on there that are very tough to get. There are others that are quite easy to get. But we are really talking about a very extensive level of autonomy here. We're not talking about lighter regulations and this or that. We're talking about we want to have our own legal regime, our own customs regime, immigration control, currency control, those sorts of things. Just because it's partly the Crypto Cities Summit as well, I think there is quite a little bit of overlap between the crypto community and free cities or international cities, and you can read about them here, but I'll go quickly through it. So you say, okay, these sound great, but what's in it for the residents? Well, we think, first and foremost, you have open, thriving communities for people to be successful. They can not be so worried about their local or national level politics. They can focus on their family, their friends, their work life, more brain power and focus associated to devoted to those things. Obviously, a world-class business environment is great, beautiful locations such as here, and then importantly, fixed fees. You sign a contract and you pay a fixed amount every year. I think, I'm not sure what this crowd is quite like, but amongst the anarcho-capitalists, the concept of paying any tax is tough. I think fees in some way solve that. Many people would be willing to pay something for disputes to be resolved, for a beautiful place with security and these sorts of things, but they want it contractually written down. They don't want it to be able to change at a whim, and because this year we want 25%, not 20%. So fees get around that. That sounds great, but why would governments do this? And of course many don't, and I think we should be honest about that. But the governments that do this, they do it for the two top reasons, as far as I have learned, are really foreign direct investment and jobs for locals. Those are the most important. Now, there are other important things too, such as index rating improvements, and you can see what the success Prosper has had with that, with the Ernst & Young index rating improvement being in the top 10. Profit sharing certainly doesn't hurt, but it's really that foreign direct investment and jobs that are the most important to most governments. So what is the business model of these cities? So first of all, Tipolis is actually a parent company, a holding company for these various cities. Our view is that we need to be doing these not just in one place, but in many different places. It's too hard to rely on nation states to be cooperative over the long term, and you just don't know what's going to be attractive to the full market, and so you want to start these in as many different places as possible. For that reason, we have each of these subsidiary companies that would actually be developing one of these international cities on their own. The profit to Tipolis would just be in form of network fees and then dividends from the cities themselves after they make a profit. So how do the cities themselves make a profit? It's really two main ways. One is through operating fees, so charging fees to residents and to businesses, potentially on land payments, and then administrative fees as well. But the real upside, at least as we think about it, is in real estate. And this is why we actually think of this whole field, it was nice to hear Dave talking before this, we call it venture estate. It's got the upside of venture capital to some degree, but ultimately it is, in many senses, real estate that is backing this sort of development. This is not necessarily supposed to be taken as gospel, these numbers, but it is supposed to give an indication as to the potential upside from a project like this. So what we're doing is starting on the top, aggregated to subdivided. Really, we're talking about buying large plots of land and then parceling them out. People are willing to pay a little bit more for more manageable chunks of land. We're taking the restrictions off of it, so there may still be regulations and development restrictions, but they are put in place by a for-profit company who has the incentive to encourage you to develop as much as possible that is still economically successful for the community. Of course, undeveloped to develop, there's some appreciation there. Typically, we're talking about starting in rural places with no one living there and turning them into cities. That's, of course, a big appreciation. And then the major thing is this legal framework that sort of wraps around the city that there's a major upside in. It's interestingly, if you multiply all of these out, they're sort of multiplicative, not one or the other. The appreciation can actually be something close to 500,000 times. And if you look at the difference in real estate between, call it your average Latin American country, rural land, all of these things on the left, and then you take a look at Singapore or Dubai or Hong Kong, it's not a perfect comparison, but you do get about 450 or 500,000 times appreciation potential. So I think that at least validates that we're looking in the right ballpark. So how do you protect these? Well, in many ways, the ways that Prospera has set up. So, of course, there's the legal and the political. You want to have international agreements, bilateral investment protection treaties that are really the sort of stick, making sure that a host government stays true to what it's guaranteed. You have the economic side of things, where you actually want to provide jobs to locals so that they're a key constituency in the voting public, and we want them to be our biggest advocates. Of course, profit sharing doesn't hurt in that regard. And then there's strategic, which can involve a number of different things. Things such as having highly mobile residents, doing multiple projects at the same time, being strategic about which countries you'd work with. Perhaps democracies that are very left-right, they did it, so we don't like it. Maybe those aren't the best places to do these projects, at least in the early stages. So Tipolis, at the moment, we don't have any publicly announced projects, but we are at any given time, and now is no different, talking to about 10 different governments. I would consider maybe about half of those to be very serious, where they definitely could potentially move forward into a project for an international city. We're also getting new requests, I would say, on a weekly basis, which is much different than even 4 or 5 years ago. So precedents, is there anything in the past or even in the current that we can learn from to show that we're not in fact crazy, that this is in fact possible? And you know about many of them from people speaking today, but I would just reiterate, of course, you have the Venetian Republic that has some aspects that we can learn from. The Hanseatic League, the Free Imperial Cities, of course, are other good examples. Existing special administrative regions are also good examples, as we learn from Singapore, Dubai, in particular the Dubai International Financial Center I'd like to call your attention to. This is actually that small plot of land within Dubai that has English common law as its basis, rather than Sharia law. And then of course Prospera and Morazan. Here's just a little bit more on just how successful Dubai's been with this model. I think those numbers, so I guess internal autonomy, that's key, what we talked about. They have common law, and then they're run not exactly by a management team, but by a sort of CEO-like figure, I would say. Those numbers over on the right are from 2022. You can see decent-sized numbers, but more importantly, the 184, that's the operating profit on $300 million of revenue. So their profit margin is well over 50%, and it's up almost 20% on the year. In fact, talking to, so that's more on the operating side. On the real estate side, they've been just as successful, but numbers are a little harder to get. And actually talking to their team, one of their big regrets is that they started this whole thing with a smaller plot of land than they should have. And so the upside is only so limited after you appreciate all of that land. There's also a lot to learn from existing city-states and micro-states. So Monaco in particular is a very good one. How does it defend itself from France to the extent that it has to, or how does it get to a point where it doesn't have to defend itself from France? How does it provide security, particularly when Formula One comes in and they're just overrun with people? What do they do? And I think that provides many models that we can learn from. So at the beginning, I guess must have skipped through it today, but one way to look at how successful this is to just take one of these case studies and try to figure out what is the value of any of these jurisdictions. I mean, is there even a way to do that? And I'm not telling you that this is the right way or the only way, but one way is to look at Singapore. You take their average price of land times how much land they have, and you get a valuation of almost $5 trillion. That's US dollars. The other way, or another addition to that would be you take the GDP of the country, you say governance probably earns some percent, and here we've just chosen 10%. You could fight me with that number, that's fine. And then you capitalize that revenue stream over time, you get $500 billion. So overall, in some sense, the value of Singapore is about $5.5 trillion. That doesn't include sovereign wealth funds that Singapore has that have investments outside of Singapore. That might be even another trillion or so based on the numbers I've seen. So it shows you here that the upside to doing these sorts of things is massive. It's of course not easy, as you've heard from Eric and from many others, but the upside is massive, and that's why you see a lot of entrepreneurs moving into the space. So just to close, I'd say, like I've mentioned, this is a huge task, but fortunately there's many different trends, and all of the trends are our friends at the moment.
Wow, That was right on time.
How about that?
Thank you, Alex.